was still dark when she woke. The air was heavy and close, and she felt trapped by it. She drew a deep breath, but found it hard to take back as her chest hurt. As the air filled her lungs, she suddenly remembered why. It was for the pain born the day before from weeping. The sort of crying that goes deep, it almost draws the very life out of you. The breath brought everything back into sharp focus. She could not lounge around again today. There were jobs that needed to be done. Although it was 2 days since those awful events outside the city wall, this was a new day. And although hope had gone and been replaced by the dark hole of grief, she knew she had to face the day and all that it brought. And what's more, she knew she had to do it alone. She stepped out into the narrow streets. The presence of darkness seemed to be creeping in every shadow. Every step she took was laboured. This was a journey that she never thought she would have to be taking. This was not supposed to end like this. They hadn't just taken away her Rabboni, her teacher, they had taken away her hope, her inspiration, her dreams for tomorrow, and her faith. How could God have let this happen? And where was God now? As she made her way into the early morning spice market, the familiar smells of frankincense and myrrh filled her nostrils. Suddenly it reminded her of the stories that the master had told her of some travelling men who had come and given him gifts as a child. Now seemed bittersweet that she was taking these same spices to anoint his broken body. It seemed maybe in one way that there was a bigger plan at work somehow. She pressed on and out of the city. The signs and symbols of her oppressors, the Roman banners, the soldiers with all of their advanced weaponry, the empire and the power and the torment that came with it. But amongst all of this, she recalled that there was once a promise of a different way. Talk about a kingdom instead of an empire, with rules of love instead of violence, justice and a hope for the future. But that promise seems now to have vanished, like a whisper in the wind, and she could not afford the energy to be sentimental about it. She continued her journey towards the tomb. As she ventured, her surroundings began to change. It was as if a new scene was being set before her. Buildings gave way to trees, dusty roads became paths of soft moss and grass, and the darkness of the city began to be broken up by the dawn appearing on the horizon. She approached the edge of the garden, and the memories came flooding back of being here on Friday. This time, though, everything looked different. As she walked, she caught her finger on a bush, on a thorn bush, and it started to bleed. Crimson red glistened in the early morning light. It's strange, she thought, how suffering can seem to alter so much. Even the simplest of objects can seem to be planning to harm you when you're already in pain. This feeling of hopelessness began to permeate into every object around her. She looked again at the thorn bush and suddenly realised that it wasn't the bush at all. It was something laid on its branches. It was the crown that had been made for the master. It must have fallen off on the way to the tomb, and she recalled that crown that they had made. The same thorns that had wounded her had opened his brow. Along with the jokes and laughter and the mocking, she held back the tears as they caught in the back of her throat. She moved on through the trees towards the tomb. She had rehearsed her speech 1,000 times to the guards in her mind. She was prepared. She did not want to be turned away, for she had come too far for that. Emotionally, spiritually and physically. I have to see him. I have to see him, she heard herself saying softly. She had a job to do. A job that would bring, in some small way, order and comfort to that battered and abused body. For one last time, she would wrap his body, as his mother had done 1,000 times for him as a baby. But now that task fell to her, and she was going to do it right. The light was breaking through the treetops as she approached the place. There was an unexpected, uneasy stillness that embraced all around her. She walked, slower, frightened, but she could not see the guards. Suddenly she realised something had happened in this place, and not by those that had suddenly fled. There was a stillness. All she could hear was her own heart beating. Her breathing quickened, and then she saw it. She stopped. The sight of what she saw seemed to both overwhelm her and strip her of all her senses. She was frozen to the spot. She felt the pain in her soul beginning to rise. It gave way to anger as she saw the open tomb before her. Why could they not leave him alone? Has he not suffered enough, she thought, and then suddenly that rage turned to fear as she realised maybe those that had robbed his body were still lurking in the half-light. She turned and she ran. She ran without looking back, and she ran hard. She had to go and tell the others. She needed to tell them she needed to be with other people. She burst into the room. She explained the whole situation, what she had found. There was chaos, and a small group hastily stood to their feet and ran to the tomb. The men were quicker and they raced ahead, and suddenly again she found herself alone and she started to pray. She didn't have any words, but something began to grow within her. Maybe it was hope, but she didn't want to hold on to it. They arrived back at the tomb. It was now light. This was a different world to the one she had left moments ago. The men had rushed in and entered the tomb and had confirmed her fears. The master was gone. They brushed past her in a confused state, and she stood outside. No one said a word. The pain was almost visible. She slumped into the open doorway of the tomb, exhausted, and began to weep. Through the tears, she lifted her eyes and looked into the blackness. It seemed to become some sort of twisted metaphor for her own soul. For the first time that day, she looked where his body had been laid, and she saw the robes that had covered him. But instead of being strung across the floor of the tomb, they were laid neatly in place, folded, organised. She stepped into the darkness. It was cold. But before she could respond to these new surroundings, there was an image, some sort of being, some sort of person in the darkness, and then words broke the silence. A question descended out of the blackness. Why do you look for the living amongst the dead? She couldn't answer. Too startled to comprehend the situation, she turned and moved quickly back out into the open, into the safety of the light. But in her panic, she clumsily tripped and fell into the arms of a stranger standing in the bright morning light. She stumbled back to gather her thoughts. He must be the gardener. He must know. He must have moved the master. He must have taken him. He will have the answer, she thought. Her voice, fractured, broken and beautiful, asked, "Where is he? Please tell me, I need him." There was no reply from the stranger, who just stood there, but his presence was strong, defined and complete. "Mary," came his reply. "Mary." She looked into his eyes and saw that it was him. Her heart melted and she was enveloped with a total peace. It was Jesus, her Jesus, and he was well. He was more than well. He had never looked so alive. He had called her name, and in that moment, everything had changed.